In 1950, Ford would launch a new model that would change the history of station wagons for a significant amount of time, and that was the Country Squire that you see here. And for all the way from inception all the way through to the last model years of the Country Squire in the early 1990s, wood or fake wood paneling would be a hallmark of the Country Squire wagon. Now, by 1970, the Country Squire had evolved significantly, and I think the 1970 Country Squire is probably my favorite. It's the last of the hidden headlamp Country Squires, and well, what's better than a hidden headlamp wagon? You could get hidden headlamps on Mercury wagons like the Colony Park in subsequent model years, but no longer could you get them on Country Squires. And it just has a cool look overall. Now, this was the second model year of this redesigned generation platform. Ford redesigned its full-size vehicles for the 1969 model year, and all wagons were now riding atop 121-inch wheelbase, whether you got the Ford or the Mercury. So interestingly, Ford employed a different philosophy than Chrysler and GM in some cases, where if you got a wagon from the competitive makes, you actually got the longer wheelbase wagon, even on the Chevrolets. You got kind of the big car wheelbase. Whereas Ford had the Ford 121-inch wheelbase on the Ford and Mercury wagon. So you had a little bit less wheelbase. And interestingly, as a consequence, these wagons from Ford, both the Country Squire and the Colony Park, are generally shorter than two-door Mercury vehicles because those ride atop a 3-inch longer wheelbase. So they look big, and they are big, but they're not quite as big as some of the larger Mercuries, or certainly the Lincolns as well. Now, the Country Squire for 1970 to me has a very menacing look because that whole blacked out kind of area up front, it's not a wall-to-wall grille. You have different textures for the grille, separate from the headlamp coverings, and the headlamp coverings extend into the fenders. But you have this whole kind of blacked out area that looks like it's a big open mouth, just this gaping mouth that's waiting to devour whatever car is in front of it. Of course, you also have a little bit of the Knudsen nose, the so-called bunky beak as well, that would become more prominent on Fords beginning with the 1971 model year. And that was something that literally Bunky Knudsen, when he came over from General Motors, he was formerly head of Pontiac, then head of GM overseas when Ford intercepted him. And Henry Ford II made him president of Ford Motor Company over Lee Iacocca. He wanted Fords to look more like Pontiacs, and that's where that nose came from. And I think it's a good look overall. Maybe he wasn't all that wrong. By the time he departed, just a few years later, the Fords would start to lose that nose, and the nose would become more blunted over time. But I think this lends a nice kind of look to the Country Squire. Now, as we rotate to the side of the vehicle, you can see that so-called W-shaped front end, very typical of cars from this era and even a little bit before. I would say by 1970, the W-shaped front end was starting to go out of vogue. It was done really by 1973 when the bumper impact standards would be put in place. This car does not have the optional cornering lamps, just as a standard turn signals and side marker lights up front there. But you do see some typical Ford styling features. The rocker area and the area just above it where the body tucks in, a so-called drag section, very typical of Fords. You can imagine that a clay modeler just took a template and dragged it across the clay in a uniform format in between the front and rear wheel. That's exactly what you see here. Very, very typical of Ford surfacing during that time frame. You do have a little kind of check in the belt line where it kicks up near the rear door. This is not a Coke bottle car because the body does not flare outboard around the rear wheel, but it does have a little element of the Coke bottle styling, that kick up in the belt line that was so typical on not only Fords but GM vehicles of the mid-1960s, and something that would really ramp down from a styling perspective once you got to the 1970s. Although Ford would continue to have it on some of its midsize cars like the Torino, even in the early 1970s. And as we rotate to the rear three-quarter view, you do notice that this car, just like the LTD, has that crease that runs the entire length of the vehicle, kind of midsection of the body. And that was something the LTD had for a number of years, even back to the 1968 LTD, which was the previous generation, had that crease that ran the entire length of the vehicle, and it was continued here. The kind of kick up that you see in the belt line, there's a surface that's just beneath that. And you can see it a little bit in the quarter panel in this particular photo and even the fuel filler door. Just something to give, I think, the side a little bit more dimension aside from just the crease itself. And what's interesting to me is Ford always had these really chunky moldings that outlined the wood grain. And I think that's back just kind of a holdover from the days when these were real woody wagons and you needed to have a decent piece of wood that kind of anchored everything together. But they kept that thick molding. I wish they had gone with a little bit thinner molding, I think, to accentuate the faux wood grain. Even look at the tailgate area and how thick the outer molding is that encompasses the fake wood grain. The other thing I will say that I think was unique to Ford, put in the comments if I'm wrong, but take a look at the air dam and the roof rack there, and you have fake wood on the air dam and the roof rack. I don't think anybody else really did that. I could be wrong. The air dam was something that was very typical on other wagons of the era, but I don't remember anybody else covering it with the faux wood grain. And we'll rotate around to the other side for this particular rear three-quarter, and I just wanted to show a couple things here. First is that little bulge that's underneath the rear quarter. That's where the spare tire sits on these Country Squires and Colony Park wagons, and that would continue for years. You'd always see that little bulge. So if you're wondering what that is, that's what it's for. Notice the exhaust pipe is diverted and directed out sideways. That's true for any of these wagons because you don't want the rear window down and you're driving and the exhaust to backdraft into the wagon. That would allow the exhaust just to kind of continue rearward and not get sucked in. Obviously, you don't want to asphyxiate passengers. And you'll notice the rear window is down here in the Country Squire. This is also the Magic Way tailgate, the three-way tailgate. And you could open the door with the window up, you could open the door with the window down, or you could drop the door like a tailgate. And that was a Ford innovation and really a great feature of these wagons that many people liked. You can also see probably that surface on the quarter panel a little bit better here that I was talking about, that kind of little edge that continues on into the rear door. I think this photo and the lighting shows it a little bit better, so wanted to point it out here. And lastly, this dead-on rear view. I thought it was interesting to just show this view because you can see how much tumble home the wagon has. Look at the midsection of the body. It's not even the widest part. You got to go lower on the wagon to get to the widest part of it. Kind of gives it this fat, little bit pudgy look, but also one where it looks rather planted because the body is the widest at the wheels, which probably doesn't do great things for the overhang with respect to the wheels. But yeah, it does lend a sense of width. And it's interesting to me, most wagons have the vertical tail lamps. Here, Ford, for whatever reason, I think just to make them look somewhat interesting, divided the tail lamps into 3 sections with these little chrome bars. A nice piece of detail. And I do think one other thing that's interesting is, look at that trim piece that's at the top of the tailgate and how it's got this blacked out section. It helps visually elongate the rear window to make it look a little bit larger. And it also then helps the molding align with the side moldings. So a little design trick that Ford employed, and they would have that for a number of years on their wagons. Now, inside your Country Squire for 1970, you had this beautiful dashboard, one of my favorite IP themes ever from Ford, this kind of wraparound dash, driver-centric cluster. Driver-centric clusters were starting to become kind of the en vogue thing with this cluster, the 1969 Grand Prix cluster. And before that, driver-centric clusters were really not a thing. You might have driver-themed instruments like the 1966 Tornado that had this blackout theme that continued on into the carpet. But the gauges in the IP weren't really, I would say, centered on the driver. And in later years, think about the 1971 GM vehicles when they would come out. All of the cars, the full-size cars, had driver-centric instrument panels except the Chevrolet. But I think that this was just kind of a whole new era for interior styling, and I think a good development overall. I like it because it's harder for the passenger to mess around with the climate control as an example, or even the radio. Leave that to the driver. The passenger doesn't need to mess around with anything. This would also be the last year for this cluster before it would be redesigned for the 1971 model year. Now you see the stubby little gear shift there. This is, let's say, helping you select the gear in the C6 transmission that's behind the 390 FE V8 underhood, which we'll talk about in a second. But wanted to point this out because these cars are the ones that Ford had trouble with jumping into reverse, particularly when you would close the door. The park pawl was not a very positive latch and would wear out. And one thing, if you have a Ford of this era, do not leave the car, especially on fast idle, in park and then go slam the door. It is a risk. One thing that you can do is kind of tug on that gear shift when it's in park and see if it will go into reverse without pulling it back. Some of them will. That detent will be worn out, and you'll just be able to shift into any gear you want. And the other thing about some of these, not this particular Country Squire in all likelihood, but some of these also have automatic parking brake releases. So you think if you put it in park, you can leave the engine running if you set the parking brake, but a lot of them have automatic parking brake releases when they get into gear too. So that was something that caused Ford a significant amount of trouble, and they had to recall these vehicles in the late 70s. The only thing they did for the recall, though, was issue a sticker saying, don't leave your car idling in park. And at least you did get somewhat decent rear legroom in these, although, as I mentioned, the wheelbase would be shorter on the Ford and Mercury versus the GM and Chrysler wagons, at least when GM and Chrysler would go to the next generation of their vehicles. GM, of course, had the clamshells that would come out in 1971. In that case, the Chevrolet Kingswood in 1971 would have a 125-inch wheelbase, just like the Bonneville Safari, etc. So you got that big wheelbase in your GM wagon. And out back, if you got the optional extra seating in the rear, Ford had these sideways-facing jump seats that passengers could sit in, two passengers, kind of one facing the other or opposite directions as opposed to the rear-facing bench seat. This is something that Ford wagons would have for many years. You'd kind of sit in the pit there with your legs. And some people really like this. I think that was why they bought Ford wagons. I have to admit, I am not a personal fan of the rear-facing seat. Now, when GM would go to the clamshell wagons, you'd actually get a forward-facing third-row seat. So that alleviated what would have been my personal concern. But, a lot of people, I think, liked this particular setup, and it was just something that was synonymous with Ford, just like those deep well trunks that a lot of their full-size cars had for many years. Now let's move under hood. And here we have the 390 cubic inch FE V8. This would be the last year for this under the hood in the Country Squire. And the air cleaner sticker here, the decal, is not quite right. It says 390 4V for 4 Venturi. You actually could not get a 390 with a 4-barrel carburetor in the 1970 Country Squire. Standard engine was a 351 cubic inch V8 that with a 2-barrel carburetor, made 250 horsepower. Optional was a 392 Venturi carbureted V8 that made 265 horsepower. And then you got the 429 2 Venturi that made 320 horsepower and the 429 4 Venturi that made 360 horsepower. So somebody has retrofitted this with the wrong decal, and I think they actually did put a 4-barrel carburetor on it, but that was not standard issue. This was the low compression 390, as I mentioned. Now you also see something else that isn't conventional here, and that is the air conditioning compressor setup. Somebody's put a more modern air conditioning style compressor. This car would have come standard with that York Tecumseh style 2-piston compressor. Ford would later start going away from that, and part of the reason was it was really hard to cool these wagons with all that interior airspace on a hot day, particularly if they were a dark color. It was just a lot for that system. Ford, as an example, the refrigeration systems on this vehicle used to hold 2 to 2.5 pounds of refrigerant, and an equivalent General Motors air conditioning setup would hold 4 to 4.5 pounds. So far more BTUs out of the GM system. And you'll notice if you operate these vehicles on a hot summer day, the Ford, you're running the fan kind of at wide open and the on max cooling, recirculating the air. Pretty much, I would say, if it's low 80s or higher, 85 degrees, let's say, you're going to be on high speed with the fan all the time, even charged on R12. just so much interior cubic feet and space to cool. A GM wagon, you might run it at full blast to start, but you'll gradually kick the fan speed down because it's just going to be too cold even on a hot day. The GM air conditioning setup was far better, and that's one of the reasons why Ford actually ended up buying it, starting with the Lincolns in the 1972 model year, and it would kind of gradually proliferate through the lineup. Ford, during this time frame, never made its own air conditioning compressor. That would come later, but during this time, they would always source air conditioning components from someone else until they ended up making their own compressor years later. So that's the 1970 Country Squire. Let me know what you think. Put a comment in the comment section, and thanks again for watching.